invite you back this evening at 5 p.m. for our 5 p.m. worship service. And we also want to remind you, as Delbert mentioned, that there is the singing today at the Gayhead congregation if you're interested in being a part of that. There are several of our members that are in need of prayer, and I just request that you remember them in your daily prayers. Many of those are in the bulletins. Delbert announced a few of those also, but please remember them in your prayers. Natalie Holloway has been in the news recently. I don't know if you followed the story about Natalie Holloway, but she was a high school graduate student that went to the country of Aruba for a graduation vacation back in 2002. And she hasn't, or 2012, excuse me, and she, get that right, 2002, and she hasn't been seen since. And she's presumed dead. You probably, years ago when this incident occurred, remember it being all over the news. There were several arrests and then people were released from jail, and there was some controversy about the way the police handled the investigation. But she's been in the news recently. I don't know if you've noticed that or not, but her father hired a private investigator, and the father and the private investigator have been doing some research, and they went down to the country of Aruba, and the private investigator discovered some human remains recently buried in an Aruban park. And so they're going to, and they already have extracted those human remains from the ground, and they're going to send those human remains off to be tested for DNA to determine whether that's actually Natalie Holloway or not. And so probably within the next few weeks we'll know whether those remains belong to her or not. DNA tests will be performed to determine whether that's her, and they'll take the DNA from the mom and father, and they'll be able to determine with accuracy whether those human remains actually belong to Natalie or not. Recently I took a trip to England, and in this trip I visited what's known as the Bassett Castle in Wales. And the Bassett Castle is said to be a castle that I have relatives that built back in the 1300s. And so, but they don't know for sure whether I'm related to them or not. You know how they can determine that? Well, there's a Bassett DNA project in which I could submit my DNA, and they can determine whether I was a part of this family or not, if I was a part of the heritage in which this castle comes from. They can use DNA to be able to do that. We are all familiar with DNA. Maybe you have heard the three-letter designation DNA before, but it stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. Don't ask me to say that again. I had to practice a lot. A lot, let me tell you. I'm glad I got it out right. But that's what DNA stands for, and so it's something that we've become recently familiar with. I was actually in law enforcement when DNA came about, and it became a way to identify people by the fluids and parts of the bodies that are left, like skin that is left at the scene. But it's used to identify whether people can be a member or are a member of a particular family. If there's questions about whether a child belongs to this father or some other father, they do DNA, and they can determine whether that child belongs to that family or not. And in Matthew chapter 12, verses 46 through 50, Jesus is standing amongst his disciples when someone comes in and says, your mother and your brothers are outside, and they want to speak with you. And Jesus says to that individual that came in, and he points to his disciples as he does it, he says, these are my mother, brother, and my brothers. Anyone that does the will of my Father in heaven, those are my mother and my brothers and my sisters. Now, I want us to understand that when Jesus says that, he's not trying to disparage his mother and brothers. We often know and we understand from John, the book of John, chapter 7 and verse 5, that Jesus' brothers, while he was on earth, didn't believe in him. They didn't believe who he was. We later know and understand that his brother James, that wrote the book of James, and possibly the Jude that wrote the book of Jude, may be his brother, and that they became believers. But there's no indication in Scripture that his mother ever wasn't a believer in him. And Jesus saying this about his mother and brothers is really not talking about his mother and brothers as much as he's talking about his disciples. And so it's important for us to understand that he's not disparaging his family when he does that. But he points out to his disciples, he says, "This is my family." Are you a part of the family of God? I bet we could go to today, I don't know how many churches are up in the high desert here, but we could probably go to every single one of those churches that exist that are Christian-based churches, and we could ask that question, and we would get an affirmative response from probably everybody there. Yes, I am a part of God's family. We might ask this question: how can you be sure that you're a part of God's family? How can you be sure? Well, this morning I want to present to you a DNA test that will tell us whether we're a part of God's family or not. And just like a DNA test, a physical DNA test that will tell us whether you're a part of a physical family, this DNA test will tell us whether we're a part of a spiritual family, the family of God. And so this morning I want us to look at the DNA test that will tell us that. Number one, the D stands for does. Notice what he says, Jesus that is, in Matthew 12 and verse 50. He says, "For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother, my sister, and my mother." Those who do the will of the Father are identified as being part of God's family. They can be identified as family members based on the fact that they're doing God's will. Are they doing some of God's will? Or are they doing all of God's will? Do you know that we could go to every religious organization that exists in the world and find that organization doing some of God's will? In fact, you could go out into the community right now and you could find people that are not religious at all doing some of God's will. In fact, one of God's will is don't murder. There are plenty of people in the world who are not murdering. They are doing some of God's will. But you see, doing some of God's will is like doing none of God's will. It's an all or nothing prospect. If you're only doing some of God's will, then it's not worth anything. You have to be doing all of God's will. It's not enough to do some of it. And as I stated, only doing some of His will is not doing His will. So there's only two categories. Please understand, two categories exist. Doing all of God's will or not doing God's will. There is no middle ground that says some of God's will puts you in His family. It's not the case. It's all of God's will. So we have to do all of God's will in order to be identified as being a member of His family. How can we do that? How can we know what His will is? Well, the simple answer, or the short answer, would be the Bible, the objective standard that exists, the very thing that God spent thousands of years putting together so that you and I can know what His will is. We don't have to guess. We have it right in front of us, hopefully. And so we have to use the standard to know what it is, that God's will is. When determining right or wrong in our religious practices, we have to determine and see what God has to say about those things. It's not sufficient to say, well, I think or I feel like. Those are not sufficient answers to determining whether we're doing right or wrong in our religious practices. We need to see what it is God has said about those things. Not just decide based on, well, that's the way things have always been done. Well, that's not an objective standard, brethren. Just because they've always been done that way doesn't mean that that's the right way. Those of you who are reading the Muscle and Shovel book understand this concept in the cutting of the ends of the ham. And some of you are just scratching your head going, what is he talking about? Well, in that book, he talks about how his mother used to cut off the ends of the ham the right way to do it. They cut off the ends of the ham because that's the way Mom had always done it. But in reality, the purpose of that was because back great-grandma or grandma was unable to fit it in the oven. So we have to understand that it's the standard that we use, or the objective standard, the Bible, that we use. And not what you think might be right or wrong. That's not how we determine God's will. If we think it's right or wrong. There are plenty of examples in Scriptures of people who thought they were doing God's will when they weren't. We need to understand that it's those that do all of God's will, knowing what His will is from the objective standard, that identify or are identified as God's family. You want to know whether you're a part of God's family? You got to have the right DNA. And the D stands for someone that does God's will. I think I missed a verse that I was supposed to. I did. I was supposed to put that on the screen. We'll go to the next one. The second thing that in the DNA process to identify us, whether we're in God's family or not, is the N. And the N stands for not. You go all the way back. We've been going through Matthew for a little bit of time. You go back to Matthew chapter 6. And in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus talks about several areas in which to do God's will. And He says, not as the Pharisees do. In verses 1 through 4, He says, don't practice your righteousness in front of men to be seen by them. In verses 5 through 15, He says, don't pray like them to receive praise of men. In verses 16 through 18, He says, don't fast like them to receive honor from men. Don't practice your righteousness. Don't pray, don't fast like the Pharisees. See, it's not enough just to do God's will. That's what the Pharisees were doing. They were doing fine, but they weren't doing it for the right reasons. And so Jesus says in Matthew 6, and that whole chapter is about not performing your righteousness the way the Pharisees do, not like the Pharisees. The Pharisees were doers, but they were just going through the actions, thinking that just doing the actions would somehow be pleasing to God. But God has always required action with the right motives. You see, it's not enough just to do the right thing. You have to do the right thing with the right motives. Not one without the other. Not the right motives without action. Not action without the right motives, but both the right motives and the action. Kind of reminds me of a passage that says that we are to do things in truth, the action, and in spirit, with the right motives in mind. And so you want to know whether you're a part of God's family or not. Number one, if you're doing God's will, the objective standard is Scripture, the Bible, as it's presented to us. If you're doing His will. And number two, doing that will not as the Pharisees do. The N stands for not as the Pharisees. Finally, the A. I skipped another verse. You know, I'm not used to this, see? Alright, I'm caught up. I'll try to do it right. I practice this too. You want to know whether you're a part of God's family, you got to do the right, you got to have the right DNA. Someone that does God's will, the D, not as the Pharisees, the N. And finally, the A, acknowledges. Someone that acknowledges. You might be thinking, acknowledges, well, why is that doing that? There we go. In Matthew chapter 10, verses 32 and 33, Jesus says these words. Therefore, whoever confesses me before men, him I will also confess before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, him I also will deny before my Father who is in heaven. You see, in order to be a part of God's family, we have to acknowledge and share Jesus with the people we come in contact with. Acknowledging Him or confessing Him before men. A lack of sharing Jesus is denying from this verse. Do you understand that? Look at verses 32 and 33 again. Whoever confesses me before men, Jesus will confess before His Father in heaven. Whoever denies me before men, a lack of confession is denial. Again, we we understand the Great Commission applies to all of us. And the Great Commission is found in Matthew chapter 28, verses 19 and 20. And hopefully we understand that it's not just for the church collectively, but for us individually. And there Jesus says these words, "Go therefore and make disciples." Now oftentimes we get confused by this, and probably because of the way it's written in the English. The Greek is much more clear. I will sometimes ask people, what's the command in verse 19? And they'll say, the command is go. The command is not go in verse 19. The command is make disciples. In fact, you could actually translate the word go there, the way it's written in Greek, the way it can be translated is as you go, make disciples. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I command you, and lo, I am with you always, even till the end of the age. Jesus there gives what's known as the Great Commission. It applies to you. It applies to me. It's part of the DNA, acknowledging Jesus. We need to share Him or acknowledge Him with others. And we need to make disciples. Ask yourself this question. If you've been a Christian for any amount of time, how many disciples have you made? Well, wait a minute, preacher, that's your job. No, it's not. I mean, it is my job, but not mine exclusively. Well, wait a minute, preacher, that's the elder's responsibility. No, it's not. Well, it is their responsibility, but not them individually. Wait a minute, preacher, that's the Bible class teachers, those people that spend all that time studying and preparing, that's their job. No, it's not. Not just theirs exclusively. You see, this command to make disciples is for you and I individually as well. It applies to every person that calls themselves Christian. Do you know how we can go back to the book of Acts and we see the beginning of the church? And do you know how it was the church spread from the area of Jerusalem and Judea? Some of you might say, well, the apostles. Well, the text says, the Bible says, that there was persecution within the church and that the disciples, the Christians themselves, went to all parts of the region. You know who didn't leave? You know who stayed in Jerusalem? The apostles did. You want to know how Christianity got spread through all that region, Asia Minor and all of that? It was done by Christians. Christians who had been persecuted in Jerusalem, leaving and going to Judea. Persecuted in Judea, leaving and going in Samaria. That's how disciples were made in the book of Acts. That's how, and the accusation is made against the Christians later on in the book of Acts, that they turn the world upside down. How did they do that? Individual Christians sharing Christ with the people they came into contact with. The responsibility of all of us. How many disciples have you made? Are you sharing? Are you acknowledging Him? Do you want to know whether you're part of God's family? I mentioned at the beginning, we could go to all of these different religious organizations within this city. We could ask that question. They'd all say that they are a part of God's family. But do they have the right DNA? Are they doing God's will? All of God's will. Are they doing it not like the Pharisees did, with the wrong motives in mind? Are they acknowledging Christ? Are they sharing those things that they've learned with their family, with their loved ones, with their friends, with the people they come into contact with? Do you want to know whether you're a part of the family of God? Here's the test. DNA. Do you have the right DNA? Do you do God's will, all of His will? We talked this morning in the class when I was teaching. We've heard and we read as we go through Scripture, we read often where it talks about submission and submit. Wives, submit to your husbands. And we're to submit Christians to the eldership. And each of us is to submit to one another. You know, I think people misunderstand the word submit. Submission means, number one, I voluntarily do it. I choose to do it. But number two, submission is demonstrated when we do something we don't like or don't want to do. You see, if I do something I already wanted to do, then I'm not submitting, I'm just just doing what I would have done. I'm doing what I would have done anyway. Okay? Behind again, I'm sorry. Submission is demonstrated when we do what we don't like. And when we do what we don't want to do. You want to determine whether you're a member of the family of God. Do you submit to all of God's will, even the ones you don't like? Even the ones you're not too thrilled about? Even the ones that might make you a little uncomfortable? That's when submission is demonstrated. Have you taken a DNA test to determine if you're part of God's family? I know Dean recently took one of those heritage DNA. It was like 67 pages. I think there was as many pages as years he was on the earth. But I read through it, and it's got all of his heritage and all. They did a DNA test, and they can tell the region that he came from and all of this stuff. And you want to know how you determine whether you're part of God's family and your heritage there? Do this DNA test. Short little test to make sure that we aren't thinking we are part of God's family when we're not. And again, we can go to all these different places and we can talk to all these different people and they'll say, I'm a part of God's family. But if you haven't had the DNA test, you can't say it with surety. The DNA test, do you do His will? All of His will, even when it's hard, even when it's uncomfortable, even when we don't like it? Do you do His will with the right motives in mind, not like the Pharisees? Did you do it in partaking of the Lord's Supper this morning, or did you just go through the motions? Did you just do the act and not think about what it was Christ did for you and I? Well, I took the bread, God, that's what you wanted me to do. But did you have the right motives in mind? Did you have the right motives in mind when you gave this morning? Or did you just drop some money in the tray because I have to do that? That's what God says I have to do. And so, God doesn't need your money. God needs your heart. And if you have the right heart, you're going to obey Him, which is to give of your means or give as you've been prospered. Did you use the right motives or did you partake with the right motives in your singing? Or were you thinking about something else? The job, the difficulties going on in your life, what's for lunch? Did you do it in your praying this morning? You see, all of these are things that are doing God's will. God's commanded us to partake of the Lord's Supper. He's commanded us to give. He's commanded us to sing. He's commanded us to pray. These are all elements of worship, but we should never be doing those things like the Pharisees did, with the wrong motives or heart in mind. God wants you to do His will with the right motives in mind, not as the Pharisees. And then are you acknowledging Him? Are you sharing Him with others? Are you confessing Him before men? Do other people know that you're a Christian, that you contact daily, that are always in your lives? A short little DNA test to determine whether you're part of God's family. How do you know you have the right DNA? A doer, not like the Pharisees, one who acknowledges Jesus in their life. The DNA. A doer, not like the Pharisees, one who acknowledges Jesus in his life. That identifies you as part of the family of God. This morning, if you're not a part of the family of God, it's because you don't have the right DNA yet. We want to help you with that. We're not going to have to take all your blood out and put new blood in. But we are going to kill the old man of sin. And you're going to rise up a new creature with some new DNA, a part of God's family. I was touched by Yukisha's letter. And I was touched, honestly, last Sunday as I saw a line stretching from here to the end of that pew to wait to say something to her and to hug her neck. The love that was generated towards her and many people by this congregation is superior. That's what it's like being a part of God's family. You know what was more important to Jesus when He said these words in Matthew chapter 12? His physical family was important to Him. Pharisees have. Please don't shortchange yourself and say, well, I had the right intentions in mind by doing it that way. Look, God knows your heart. He wants you to be right. He wants you to have the right DNA and be a part of His family. So this morning, if you've been struggling in those areas, we can help, and we can, just like Isha last week when she came forward, we're going